Well, let me just read just a passage from your book. You say, it's hard to believe, but then again, that was pretty much Washington's game plan for Iraq. Shock and terrorize the entire country, deliberately ruin its infrastructure, do nothing while its culture and history are ransacked, then make it all okay with an unlimited supply of cheap household appliances and imported junk food. In Iraq, the cycle of culture erasing and culture replacing was not theoretical. It was all unfolded in a matter of weeks. So, if I'm reading you right, it sounds like you're saying that the chaos that resulted at the outbreak of the war and continues to the present was something that was calculated.
Well, you know, what I'm arguing in the book is that there is an extreme, not that it's calculated, but there is an extreme comfort level with disaster, which isn't to say that Donald Rumsfeld wanted Iraq to be looted. But he did shrug and say stuff happens when he found out that it was. And that's what I mean, that it's that there is an understanding that when this kind of chaos takes place, it actually is an opportunity. And there's in Imperial Life in the Emerald City, Rajiv Chandrasekaran talks about how all of these CPA officials reacted to the looting. Like the person who was in charge of Iraq's universities looked at the universities being looted and thought, well, that'll help me because I need to replace this entire education system anyway, so they're sort of just, you know, doing the demolition stage for me. And I really do think that that was, you know, someone like Thomas Friedman described the mission in Iraq not as nation building, but nation creating.
Creating a model for...
Well, I think that this was quite open, but I just want to contextualize the quote that you just read because it was you know, I was drawing an analogy between what has happened in Guantanamo, where prisoners are held for years, and then I was very shocked to learn in some of the testimony that's come out of Guantanamo that there was this odd building, which is known by the prisoners and the guards as the Love Shack, and when a prisoner is to be returned home, they're taken to the Love Shack for a few days and given Pringles and fast food and allowed to watch Hollywood movies and then sent home. So I quote one of the prisoners, one of the Tipton Three, the British prisoners, who says, you know, I think that they were trying to make up for the fact that they tortured us for 3 years by giving us Pringles and fast food. So yeah, I said, well, I guess, you know, it sounds crazy, but look at what they did in Iraq. The country was looted. Nobody tried to stop it. It was bombed. And then it was all supposed to be okay because Paul Bremer rides in and says, Iraq is open for business. You know, the shops
so from
go
the
shopping.
From the perspective of disaster capitalism, was the Iraq War a success?
Well, I think no and yes, in the sense that there was a Plan A, and the Plan A, we can see what that Plan A was just because Paul Bremer left, you know, a copious paper trail.
Bremer was already like Plan B or C, right? I mean, he'd already come in on the wing in the wake of the failure of Jay Garner and the initial plan, which was to be greeted really, as with, you know, flowers and candy.
Well, I think that Garner was. I think that Bremer wasn't actually Plan B. I think that it was actually Bremer was brought in at that stage because Rumsfeld felt vindicated, actually, by how quickly Baghdad fell, and Garner had always been pushed on him by the State Department, and he was riding the success of the invasion, the fact that he had predicted it would be a cakewalk, that it kind of was, and then they got their guy in, Paul Bremer, on this country creation mission. And if we look at what Paul Bremer did that first summer, there was quite the swagger to his step, running around Iraq with his Blackwater security guards and just, you know, announcing, one of the first things he announced was that Iraq was open for business, absolutely unrestricted free trade. He unveiled a new foreign investment law that was described by The Economist as the wish list for foreign investors, which meant that foreign companies could come in, own 100% of Iraqi assets and take 100% of the profits out. You know, all of this, there was, you know, 40 or 50 of these edicts. That's what I mean by the paper trail. There was even the 15% flat tax, which is a Republican sort of pet policy that's never been imposed here.
Exactly. You couldn't get it in Washington, so let's get it in Baghdad.
So I think Plan A, we just have to look at what Bremer did. Plan A was to turn Iraq into a model free market,
right.
and then to introduce democracy. And I think it's important to get the order right, because it was crucial for in Bremer's period that he do this extreme country makeover before Iraqis were allowed to vote. And his real political battle while he was there was that Iraqis kept trying to vote before he was finished, right? And so there were local elections that were canceled by Bremer, and then there were huge demands in that first year, big protests in Baghdad and Basra, demanding immediate elections to appoint the first government, and this was overridden by Bush and Bremer, who said, no, we're going to appoint that government. So I really do think it's important to understand the order, because we often hear that the goal was to bring Iraqis democracy, but it was a very particular kind of democracy in which all the decisions would be made first, and then they would be allowed to vote.
So what's your diagnosis then of why, I mean, even, if, let's say, looking back over the narratives of the war, it seems to me that, Garner was sent in because they didn't really care to plan. There was this view that it would, everything would happen organically in the wake of the invasion. And Bremer comes in, and Bremer is making up a lot of these decisions relatively on the fly. He's clearly falling back on ideological predilections, and he's got a lot of kind of hack Republicans around him who have these free market ideas that they're taking off the shelf and imposing. But why then wasn't the whole occupation planned for in advance if this was intended to create this free market society that you describe? I mean, it seems like...
Well, first of all, no, I don't actually think it was that deliberate. I don't think Iraq was invaded so that it could be turned into a free market economy. I think Iraq was invaded... the explanation that rings truest to me is in Ron Susskind's 1% Doctrine. It's the Cheney idea of needing to send a message to the world that this is what happens when you mess with the United States, and that Afghanistan did not present a target-rich enough environment for that kind of form of mass violent communication. And Iraq was chosen to send that message to the world for a variety of reasons. One, because it was a target-rich environment. Two, because, as Alan Greenspan said, it was sitting on the third largest oil reserves in the world. Three, because there was practice in the sense that of the first Gulf War had been refought in war games by the U.S. military for 12 years. And in fact, the shock and awe manual, which was the sort of guidebook for the invasion, was not a generalized war strategy. If you read the shock and awe manual, it starts by saying this manual is answering the question, if we had the Gulf War to fight over again, how would we do it and make Saddam's army fall? So it was always a guidebook for refighting that war. And so I think that so all of these forces converged, and once it was clear that Iraq was going to be invaded, then and there was obviously, as we all know, there was a battle between the State Department and the Pentagon, and Rumsfeld won the first round. He won because the war was over quickly, and Garner was the less ambitious plan. Garner was, okay, let's have quick and dirty elections, let's secure the oil, and let the IMF finish the job. I mean, it wasn't a plan for ongoing occupation. And it was because I think Rumsfeld was so vindicated, or seemed to be for a little while there, in his downsized military shock and awe strategy, that he was able to do something much more ambitious than was planned, which was to follow the Tom Friedman vision of let's do some country creation.
Well, just reading your book, it seems like there was a measure of intention. You're arguing there was a measure of intentionality to
for some people,
to the failure, just because it requires them to fall back on privatizing Reconstruction, privatizing warfare. It sounds like you're arguing that this great debate that happened before the war about the force size, where you had Shinseki and a lot of other people saying you're crazy to go in with such a small number of troops occupying a country, requires this vast army, but Rumsfeld and his ilk argued, no, we need to go in with a small footprint because it's the future of warfare. And you seem to be implying that Rumsfeld and his ilk were making this argument because they wanted to basically privatize in the end. The revolution that they wanted was the privatization of all these various forms of warfare.
Well, what I'm arguing is that there were two simultaneous privatizations. Actually, there were three simultaneous privatization agendas going on, swirling around the Iraq War. There was the one that we could see from Bremer, which was very open about, riding in and announcing the privatization of the state companies.